for joining us for today's webinar titled Pedagogical Reforms in Kenya, Ghana, and Botswana, Challenges and Opportunities. Before I introduce our panelists, some housekeeping. Please keep your microphone muted and your camera off. We will be using the chat function for your questions. We encourage you to type these questions throughout the presentation. There is no need to wait until the end. And the structure for today's webinar will be as follows. We will start first with a presentation, and then we will move on to the Q&A based on your questions. So today's panelists include our very own Rebecca Schendel, who is Managing Director in the Center for International Higher Education here at Boston College. Prior to joining us here, she served as lecturer in education and international development at the Institute of Education, University College London, UCL, until March of last year. We are also joined by Tristan Mccowan, Professor of International Education at the Institute of Education, UCL. His most recent book is Higher Education for and Beyond the Sustainable Development Goals. We hope also to be joined throughout our session, especially in the Q&A, by our colleagues, Richard Tabulawa, who is Associate Professor and former Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Botswana. He is the author of the book, Teaching and Learning in Context, Why Pedagogical Reforms Fail in Sub-Saharan Africa. We're also joined by Mary Omingo, who is education consultant and adjunct lecturer at Strathmore Business School, Strathmore University in Kenya. She is one of the founding members of AFELT, the Association for Faculty Enrichment in Learning and Teaching, as well as Christine Aduyebwa, who is Associate Professor in Higher Education and Teacher Education at the University of Cape Coast in Ghana, as well as hopefully Kane Rolson, who is Associate Professor of Education and International Development at UCL. So I would like to invite Rebecca for some opening remarks. And like we always do, we invite to type your questions throughout the presentation using the chat function.
Thank you so much, Gerardo, and thank you all of you for joining us. I know it's a very busy time of the year. Certainly those of us at universities in the Northern Hemisphere are racing up against the end of the semester, but I think everyone's racing up against the holiday season. So thank you for taking the time with us today to learn a little bit about this project and also to talk more broadly about the topic that we'd like to talk with you all about today, which is pedagogical reform in 3 sub-Saharan African contexts. So just to start by saying that we decided in the interest of time, it made sense for just one voice to lead the presentation today. The transitions between speakers often takes up a lot of time, but I feel a little funny doing all of the presenting myself, as this is absolutely a team effort that we're presenting on today. So Tristan and I were co-PIs of this project when I was at UCL, but also we worked very closely with all of the colleagues that Gerardo just outlined, and hopefully we will be joined by many of them during the Q&A today. And just to say, the way that we're thinking about the presentation today, we wanted to talk more broadly than just the results of the study that we conducted. So we are going to talk about the study, but I'm going to try to be brief in terms of the design and those kinds of things, because we really want to focus on the implications and the broader question about what the study highlighted about the topic of pedagogical reform. So I'll race through some of that background content, but of course, we're happy to talk about that in the Q&A if that is helpful. So just to say what this project was, it was the Pedagogies for Critical Thinking project. So we're not going to spend much time talking about the critical thinking part today, but just to say that what we were particularly looking at was pedagogical reforms that aimed to encourage student critical thinking skills. And we'd be happy, I'm sure, to entertain questions about why we did that, but just sort of that's more of a background point for the implications around actually how reform is implemented and does succeed. But this was a project that was initially intended as a 3-year project. It ended up extending to 4 years because I had a baby in the middle of it, but that worked out well in terms of the fact that we had a longitudinal design anyway, and it gave us a little extra time to complete the study. It was joint funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and also the Department for International Development in the UK. And so our main objectives really were points 2 and 3 up here on the slide. So we were interested in looking at how pedagogical practices or reforms that had been implemented at universities in the 3 countries in our study were affecting student critical thinking ability and the development of those skills, but also to probe sort of how that process worked, to better understand how universities do approach that really complex process of changing pedagogical approaches. And then the first objective I think is also worth highlighting. So the design for this study was broadly based on my doctoral work. I had looked at this same question in the Rwandan context. And that study, my doctoral study was much more sort of, I looked at all of the public universities in Rwanda with this question. But what became clear through that work was that there were pockets of innovation where I wasn't expecting to find them. So we wanted to actually start from that premise with this study. We wanted to start assuming that there were places where reform had been attempted, where teaching was being changed, rather than sort of starting with what is you often see in the literature, quite a deficit understanding of teaching in African universities, assuming that everything is traditional and nothing has changed. We knew that wasn't the case. So we wanted to start with innovations and sort of have as a side objective, bringing those to the fore and highlighting what is happening in the region that is interesting and new. So it was a 3-country study, not comparative in the sense that we weren't trying to see whether students in Ghana improved in their critical thinking ability more than students in Kenya. It was more that we brought it 3 countries in because we wanted some depth of sort of variety, some different structural considerations. So to think about this question in a sort of diverse landscape. So we chose 3 countries that are similar, obviously in many ways, 3 Anglophone contexts, 3 contexts that have a British colonial model, so similar models of higher education. Also quite advanced systems of higher education, if you want to call it that. You know, all of them are thinking about pedagogy and thinking about teaching and are not, there are other countries in the region that are having to focus on much more basic aspects of their higher education systems. But also there's differences as well, of course, different parts of the region, but also significant differences in terms of population and in terms of GDP, which means that, for example, the country of Botswana has a lot more money to spend per student than Ghana or Kenya would, which has implications on the public sector. So this was a mixed methods longitudinal study, broadly speaking. So we were following student outcomes. We were interested in the critical thinking ability of students as they came into university, and then again 3 years later when they were completing their programs. And then alongside that quantitative assessment, we were doing a series of case studies, qualitative case studies of the institutions in the sample, trying to get a better sense of actually what teaching and learning looked like in those different sites, and how the process of reform was working in the reform institutions. So this is, I think, maybe the important point of the study in terms of the results. So we were, as I mentioned, purposefully interested in finding institutions where we knew reform had been conducted. So we started with a series of seminars in each of the stakeholder seminars in each of the countries to get a sense of where these pockets of innovation were. So we started with that sample, so 2 to 3 institutions in each country. And then we found comparison sites where similar reforms had not been happening. So we ended up with 6 sites in Kenya and Ghana and 4 in Botswana in total. But of those, 3 in Kenya, 3 in Ghana, and 2 in Botswana were what you might want to call our innovation sites. So for the purposes of this webinar today, we're really focusing on that since those were the reform institutions. So just give you a sense of what these innovations were. As you can see, we had a range of public institutions and private institutions here. We also had a range in terms of what we were looking at in terms of the level of the institution. So we had 2 full institutions in our sample. Everything else we were looking at a faculty or a department within a larger institution where they had implemented a reform, but at that more local level. And in terms of the innovations, you can see some similarities. So there were 4 institutions that had sort of curriculum-wide innovations. So one was had approached, or rather had implemented a liberal arts model across the whole institution. And 3 were what is broadly conceived of as problem-based learning. So they had brought PBL into the curriculum across most of the courses. Another very frequent innovation was a the implementation of a faculty development program, quite an active one, where the institution was trying to train faculty across or faculty members across the faculty or across the department, or in some instances across the whole institution. Another popular one was community placements, where students were out in the community doing work. And all of these are innovations that are likely to, according to the literature, improve critical thinking. So we included them in the study. So starting off with whether or not these reforms were implemented, that's always the first evaluation question, right? And the answer is yes, they all were. So none of these reforms just never happened. That being said, it was clear that there was sort of uneven uptake of the reforms. So looking across the 8, some were more, I guess, that higher levels of fidelity to their initial plans. So some did absolutely everything that they had intended to. Others, maybe there was a little bit of unevenness. And interestingly enough, we didn't find any sort of correlation between the type of institution and whether or not that happened in terms of whether public institutions or private institutions. Rather, there seemed to be a number of structural factors that really make a difference in terms of whether a reform is implemented or not. And the 3 that really stood out to us were, first of all, alignment between the approach that was being implemented as part of the reform and bigger regulations. So one really good example of that was alignment between pedagogy and assessment. So for instance, one of the problem-based learning sites was a department within a public university in Ghana. And from our observations, absolutely that had happened at the level of the teaching. So the teaching, that the curriculum had been completely reformed. Teaching was all around problems. It was all around group work and solving problems. At the same time, at the national level in Ghana, there are regulations around assessment that require that, first of all, 70% of a final grade be determined by the final exam. And second of all, that dictated the format of the final exam as being quite sort of dictative, and students would need to regurgitate content essentially to pass the exam. So a misalignment fundamentally between the kind of teaching that the department was trying to implement and the assessment structures that they were stuck with. So a good example of a structural factor that was impeding their ability to do the reforms that they wanted to do. Another structural reform, or structural factor rather, is infrastructural support from the institution, particularly in light of large enrollments. And when I say large, that's in a relative sense. Sometimes we weren't necessarily seeing huge class sizes, but they might have been much bigger than had been the case when the reform was first implemented. So whenever you see an uptick in students, that can affect the design and the way you approach teaching. And in the institutions where there was no support to support the faculty in that change, struggled more to maintain fidelity to their initial plans. And another one was support from accrediting bodies. So when the accrediting bodies that were accrediting a particular field were really supportive of the reform, for obvious reasons, you could see that the reform was more successful. But that's just about whether the reform happened. Whether the reforms then had an impact was actually what we were really interested in looking at. So did any of those factors have any impact? So when we looked at our results, I would say there's sort of 3 main findings that came out of the study. The first finding being that, broadly speaking, the interventions sites did better than the control sites. So when we were looking at this particular learning outcome of critical thinking ability, in general, the 8 interventions, students improved more than in general the 8 controls. So there is something to be said for trying to change something seems to make a difference. But interestingly enough, the second finding is, and we've got this mostly from our qualitative data, is that actually all of the sites, you could see evidence of what you might call learner-centered pedagogy. So even places where there hadn't been an explicit reform or an explicit new way of teaching brought in, this discourse of what learning should look like had obviously filtered in. So in all of the sites, you could see attempts to bring in discussion, attempts to bring in group projects, attempts to sometimes have open-ended questions on exams. There were changes there was adherence to sort of those broadly spoken norms of learner-centered pedagogy in all of the sites. At the same time, there was not even improvement. So clearly there was something else going on. And what I'm showing you here is actually what we found to be the most illuminating way to think about this was actually not a straight baseline end line comparison, because when you do that, you kind of forget about the role of other factors, i.e. the fact that these institutions were different. So we had different institutions with different kinds of students in them, and some whole institutions, for example, had students with lower socioeconomic background and different kind of secondary school preparation from others. So if you bring those in, so if you do a regression model and you look at where you would expect the students to be at the end of their time, given where they came in versus where they actually ended up being. That to us seemed like the most important way of looking at this. And if you use that, we found 3 institutions, which you might call standout institutions. So places where the gains were much larger than you would expect, given who the students were. So those to us seem to be the institutions to focus on in terms of what makes the biggest difference. And what we found, we started by thinking, is it that they had a similar kind of reform? Not really. 2 of the 3 were these problem-based learning. Two of the 3 were problem-based learning interventions, and that makes sense. And that kind of curriculum reform would seem to be something that would affect critical thinking. But it's not as straightforward as that, because we had another problem-based learning site in our sample that did not have the gains. In fact, the gains were much worse than we would have expected. And also we had a third standout institution that was not that. So clearly it's not just about method. And that is supported by what I said before about the fact that all 16 sites, you can see some evidence of learner-centered pedagogy being attempted. So this doesn't seem to be just something about how there are certain ways of teaching that we need to tell lecturers to implement. And what's crucially important about that is when you look at reforms across the region, mostly they're focused on method. So we were interested in seeing what else might be happening. And what became clear to us is what was much more important, and I should say, this is in particular, again, looking at critical thinking. You can see other kinds of learning, other kinds of gains that you might want students to have, but this might not be the case. But if you're thinking about critical thinking in particular, what stood out to us in these 3 institutions was related to what you might call teaching orientations. So for those of you who aren't familiar with that concept, Kember and Gao seminal publication in the 90s talked about this, but essentially it's saying that there's a difference between a lecturer who understands their role as being about facilitating learning and understands teaching as being about exploring things that are not known together, as opposed to a teacher seeing their role as about transmitting knowledge where they are the expert that are transmitting into the minds of the students. These are long quotes, so I won't go through them, but broadly speaking, we could see evidence of both of these orientations in our data. So we could see people present themselves very much in the learning facilitation frame and others much more in the knowledge transition frame. That second quote is very clear. You need to prepare well, make sure you're imparting the knowledge that your student lacks. That's about as much of a definition of knowledge transition orientation as you could find. And we also picked up on epistemological orientation. So whether lecturers were thinking that their purpose was to explore what was not known in their field, as opposed to impart what was known. That is the sort of the theoretical background. But what's interesting is we could see individual instances of a learning facilitation orientation in all of our sites. So individual lecturers vary, and we could see individual lecturers everywhere that espoused those kinds of understanding. What stood out in our data with those 3 institutions that I highlighted was that in those 3 institutions, all of the lecturers that we talked to, everybody had that same kind of understanding of teaching. So that pointed to us to the fact that there was a teaching culture that had been inculcated, that there was a shared understanding within that department or faculty or institution about what teaching was for. And crucially, we seem to see in our data that there's a link between creating such a shared culture and having positive outcomes, at least in terms of critical thinking. So to sort of sum up before we open up, the challenges and opportunities when it comes to pedagogical reform that we could see from this data. So clearly there's lots of challenges. Faculty orientations towards teaching can be a challenge. So if you have an entire faculty of lecturers with knowledge transmission orientations towards teaching, it can be difficult to shift those. People teach the way that they were taught themselves. There's sort of an internal philosophical aspect to this. What do I see myself as? Do I see myself as the expert or not? And those kinds of sort of status questions play into this as well. So certainly faculty orientations can be a barrier to successful pedagogical reform. Student resistance to new ways of teaching, we definitely picked up on that in the data that, if you're asking students coming in from a secondary school system that has been very knowledge transmission and then asking them to learn in a different way, there's student resistance as well. That can be a challenge. The misalignment that we pointed out, even if you shift teaching, if you haven't shifted other structures, that can be a problem. Clearly, class size can be a major impediment, particularly when there's no infrastructural supports in place. So how do you encourage this kind of teaching when you have hundreds of students in your classroom? And another piece we picked up on that's an interesting one that might be worth talking about in the discussion is we had a few sites where 100% of the faculty had been students in that site themselves. So that often happens in a context where maybe only one university in the country teaches a particular discipline. It would make sense that then all of the faculty, presuming that they're local faculty, would have come up through that university. And in a way, although that creates collegiality and shared understanding and a shared culture, that can sometimes be a culture that's quite resistant to reform because everybody understands only one way of doing something. At the same time, there's some opportunities. And I think to us, what came out of the data was that departmental culture is such an important factor. And that's an opportunity because there's things you can do to foster a culture that are not necessarily that expensive in terms of financial costs. Of course, it can take time, but it's not something hugely expensive. And when we're talking about less resourced context, that's an important thing. So some of the things that stood out to us as ways that these institutions had developed that shared culture, we'd noticed when institutions were looking at curriculum design and redesign as a shared process, so faculty were talking about what they were teaching and why they were teaching the way that they were, that seemed to make a difference. The articulation of a really explicit teaching and assessment philosophy we could find in all three of our standout institutions. So new faculty knew how teaching is done here, students entering knew how teaching was done here, that seemed to make a difference. And as I mentioned, the role of diversity in these processes. So all three of these institutions had new faculty coming into the system who hadn't necessarily, or coming into the institution who hadn't necessarily been trained there. And that seemed to have made a difference because then you actually have to talk about things. You have to talk about why you're doing things the way you're doing them. And that seems to perhaps foster culture. So I guess our final conclusions, well, first of all, we're happy to say that the data shows that there is pedagogical reform coming across the region. You sometimes read about the yellow notes, the yellowing notes that lecturers read in African universities. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore. That's a good thing. A maybe less good thing is that some of those reform efforts are not yet bearing fruit. And largely that's because generally the focus has been on method, forgetting about the importance of this cultural piece. So I guess there's an implication in terms of faculty development in the region. So centers for teaching excellence and other places that are being developed with the intention of supporting reform need to be thinking about this sort of psychological, philosophical aspect, as well as just teaching people tools and tricks and methods. And then of course, there's a parallel need to also address some of those macro level structures like assessment regulations and accreditation and that kind of thing. But I will stop there just to say that we do have a paper coming out, hopefully very soon, in teaching in higher education. So we hope you will check that out when it comes. But for now, I'm going to stop talking and see what questions there are and turn it over to the rest of my colleagues. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for that introduction. I think while we wait for a few questions, so we have the first question coming in. And this question is from Thomas Godfrey Fawcett. And the question is, I have seen from some researchers and educators the argument that promoting critical thinking, such as problem-based learning, show promise, even when students are assessed using traditional mechanisms, such as exams. Do you agree with this, or do you think reforming assessment practice is as important as teaching practice, right, or reforming teaching practice? And I was able to see in the participant list that Dr. Mary Omingo was joining us as well. So feel free to unmute yourself and turn on your video, Mary, if you're able to do that. But that is the first question. I wonder, Tristan or Rebecca or Mary, if you would like to address that.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, we can hear you okay. Go. I think you're muted now, but we could hear you just a moment ago.
Did you want to answer that, Mary, or? No. Okay, well, I mean, perhaps I can make just a quick comment on that, more of a general one, and that's that I think, you know, exams can take many different forms. I mean, an exam is, I suppose, strictly defined is just a kind of a live form of assessment where you're usually not allowed to, or you don't have time for extensive consultation. But I think it can take a very different kinds of forms, some of which might be assessing critical thinking or on which critical thinking might help, and others in which it might not. I mean, I think there are forms of exam which absolutely privilege rote learning and memorization of a set syllabus, and that really critical thinking is almost irrelevant to. But there are other forms of exam that might be very challenging and absolutely fit with critical thinking. So I think it's not necessarily a question of exam or not exam, but what goes in it, and the extent to which it's actually promoting the kind of independent thinking and so forth, or not. I think that's sort of very generic answer to sort of initial answer. But I think a more contextualized one is that, I mean, assessment did appear to be fundamental in terms of change or not change in terms of these contexts, as in all higher education systems. You know, there's at all levels of education, there's you know, the phenomenon of the tail wagging the dog, as it were. You know, what ends up assessing is what carries the most weight and ends up determining what happens in classrooms. So transformation of assessment practices is certainly fundamental, but bearing in mind that institutions rarely have complete autonomy in this. So in most cases, you've got national regulations that constrain what institutions can do, either because of professional bodies or because of ministries or boards of higher education that put those in place. In the countries in question, generally speaking, it's not a regulation that everything has to be exam. There's in all the cases, there's a portion that's coursework and so forth, but a statutory considerable component of that exam, which is rather fixed and that can be a barrier. So certainly national level policy, dialogue and mobilization is very important in bringing change.
Just if I could just add one really quick thing is the assessment we were using to assess students, which I'm happy to talk about if people want to know, but it was the format was trying to replicate how you might use critical thinking in a real world type scenario. And what was interesting is that we did see, so for one really good example is this one institution in Ghana where the teaching had been completely changed. It was completely problem-based. Observing in the classroom, you would absolutely think that the students would do very well on that assessment, and they didn't improve that much over time. And when we really probed it, it seemed to be that largely a lot of it was because actually those final exams were still dictating a lot of the student behavior, even with all of the teaching changes that had happened in the classroom. So rather depressing finding, but an important one, I think.
We have another question this time. Mary, would you like to add before we move on to the next question?
Yes, I just wanted to add something. I think it is important that the assessment practices are also, reformed, because like in the institution in Kenya where we have PBL, okay, the students really learn using PBL, but at the end of it all, and I think what Tristan said about what really goes into the exam really matters, because at the end of it all, they just cram the slides, whatever is on the slides, because that is what the lecturers are also setting. Yeah, so I think both of them are really, really key, for critical thinking.
Great, thank you. Our next question is coming from one of our students, Bridget, and the question is, if you could probably elaborate on what aspects of diversity impact departmental culture in the study that you conducted. For example, are there generational trends influencing how faculty are able to promote reform? Or perhaps is it that institutional diversity, perhaps diversity in institutional type was the more salient factor?
Who wants to take that first? Tristan, do you want to say something? Do you want me to?
I would just make one comment about that, and I think it's there is quite an awkward element to this, because you can sort of slip into ageism. But in almost all of the sites, there was a real sense of a generational tension. And of course, it wasn't across the board, and there are exceptions and so forth. But there was a sense that there was a kind of a younger or an earlier career generation that were pushing a more, to fit the stereotypes, that were pushing a more progressive agenda and coming up against an older or more established generation that were resisting. So you know, for sort of fear of falling into kind of tired tropes, so that was certainly something that we observed in practice. But I think another thing that, and this comes out of Rebecca's earlier research in Rwanda, she might like to speak to a bit. There's also a question of international exposure and links, which is, you know, usually, like in most cases, a positive thing in term, or if not international, national. So linking in with the point that Rebecca made about the sort of the dangers of endogeneity of people coming through and not moving to other. So circulation amongst institutions, and for those who are privileged enough, circulation internationally for study and so forth was a really positive thing in terms of cross-fertilization of ideas and so forth.
So we also just to say, also circulation between industries sometimes an institution. You could see when there were, particularly more applied fields, when there were faculty who had worked in industry and then came back, that also seemed to be an important way of getting out of that endogeneity.
So we're definitely having a very active discussion. This is great, and we encourage you all to continue with your questions and your comments. One is just a very brief comment from Ishmael Munene. It sounds like some of these themes are resonating with our audience, and they seem to track with, in this case, Ishmael's experiences. But the next question, I think, is really, really important as well, which is first, you know, fascinating presentation. But the question is related, right, to these different orientations, right? So, so the question is coming from Paul Ashwin. I am interested in the positioning of faculty orientations as a barrier. Is it not more positive to see these as the gateway for developing approaches to teaching? And also there is a question about whether learning facilitation is a rich enough concept to support teachers in developing new ways of teaching, as it intends to focus the discussion on method, which you have already identified can be a problem. So I guess the question here is about the how, right? Like, in what ways can we engage colleagues? How can we get colleagues talking with each other, right, about their orientations toward teaching? Especially if I may just add, based on what we have discussed here, there is a lot of perhaps familiarity already, right? We have colleagues who have been working for a long time, or that have known each other for a long time. So are there any thoughts perhaps in how do we facilitate these discussions, or how is this happening already perhaps?
Are we invited to participate? My name is Ishmael Munene. Are we invited? I was just in another meeting, so I came in late, and I don't want to disturb the sequence, but
yes, absolutely. Generally, the easiest way, because we have such a large number of participants and it's very difficult to keep everybody on the same screen. We would not like to miss anybody. So the best way to send comments and questions is through the chat function, just like you did a moment ago. So if you type your question, we will be very happy to read it out loud for our presenters. Thank you.
Yeah, mine is not really a question, is that I've been dealing with this. I spent 1 year at sabbatical in a private university I won't mention. It's a private, just trying to address these issues. And Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship gave me 2 fellowships to do this in that same university. So actually I spent 2 years in that university trying even to develop a faculty development center to address these issues. And actually, I've published a paper with a vice chancellor of that university, what we would call a president of a university, and the dean of education. We were trying to address these issues. And one thing I tried to do when I was on sabbatical is actually to give students a take-home assignment rather than just giving them exam in class, which was the tradition, so that we develop this critical and application pedagogy in terms of teaching. And actually I encountered a lot of resistance, including being reported. But then I told them that's how we are gonna move away from this issue of dictating notes and memorizing notes. And actually students were very hostile. But then I discovered then the issue is actually begin with the faculty and get a buy-in from the administration. So they were willing actually to develop a faculty development center. And I did write a proposal. Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship gave me 2 fellowships to go and spend actually almost 6 months at the university, the private university. And then I encountered a lot of resistance. So it's something I'm writing on. I'm writing a book on that because I spent a whole year collecting a lot of data, but I have a preliminary article in Journal of Center for Teaching and Research about this faculty development issue. Now, this is a private university in Kenya. I won't mention the name of the institution. Until 2018 is the last time I did this faculty development issue, the proposal. But again, it is very, very difficult even to involve the faculty in discussing the issues. My issue was that I was seen as an outsider trying to bring the Americanism into what is traditionally Kenya. Now, every 95% of the faculty in that university were actually graduates of the same university, okay? And it was quite an experience, and until I gave up, but that's me, but that's the experience I wanted to share. Thank you.
So it definitely sounds like a lot of what Rebecca was presenting has resonated with your experience and with others as well. I think an important question as well, just looking down the chat, in addition to this, there is a question, of course, and this one is coming from one of our research fellows in the center, Elena Denisova-Schmidt. And the question is academic integrity an issue? And I know that this wasn't the focus of your research, but there are, right? Like we know that many of these challenges and opportunities overlap with each other. And I know that Elena's research has been focused, of course, in academic integrity. So is there anything that you could say to this issue based on this project?
I want to just be sure we don't forget Paul's question in the mix. Thank you, Paul. I would have known that you would ask the provocative question. And I have to say, as I was working on the slides, I really struggled putting faculty orientations to teaching down as a challenge, because I wanted, probably what I should have done is put it as both a challenge and an opportunity, because I agree there's a danger to positioning it as only a challenge. I think what we were trying to say is it can be a challenge. It can also be an opportunity. So, I mean, I suppose the challenge comes when you have a very lockstep, everyone in the same sort of orientation towards teaching as being about knowledge transmission. It can be quite difficult to change that, even with all the trainings on method in the world. And that is, I think, what we were picking up on, that was the case in some contexts where people could say all the things they were supposed to say about learner-centered pedagogy, but when push came to shove, actually what their group projects looked like or what their class discussion looked like wasn't going to foster those kinds of skills because of those orientations. So in that way, I do think they are rightfully positioned as a barrier. At the same time, they should be also positioned as an opportunity. And I think that's what we were trying to do in a clunky way by saying that, that what we could see in these instances, and certainly what I found in my doctoral work in Rwanda, is that even if you were to come into an institution with quite a transmission orientation, if the institution itself had a shared teaching culture that was not that way, there seemed to be some evidence that you could change. And so in that way, so when there's that shared collective understanding, that seemed to be a real opportunity that we wanted to highlight. I'm sure more could be said in your question, but I just wanted to be sure we didn't forget about that and make sure the others can come in.
Maybe, well, if we're on this one before we go on to the integrity one, and I'm sure Mary will want to come in on that, but maybe I just say something about Paul's question as well, which is, yeah, I agree, a challenging one. I mean, I think on a sort of initial level, clearly, you want to avoid a deficit model in approaching these things and frame it positively, and also, of course, not sort of demonize memorization and content, because they clearly have their role. And if you went too far to the other extreme, you might want to rebalance it the other way. But I think there is a deeper aspect to this question that is very hard to explain away. And I think it's important to be clear that in this project, we had a particular conception of critical thinking. And you know, we had a very short presentation to start off with, so we didn't have time to go into it. But it was, you know, this is not the only conception of critical thinking that's possible. And the project had a kind of an etic rather than an emic approach in that sense. The idea wasn't to sort of start by sort of revealing what the unique local conceptualizations are. That's another fascinating project, and we did have some data on that. But what we're talking about here is a conceptualization that we took to all of the contexts, partly because actually institutionally they all signed up to them. It wasn't something that we sort of brought from nowhere. There was a common denominator that the institutions actually affirmed this particular conception of critical thinking, which is a fairly technical one based on analysis, not the sort of deeper Freirean forms of criticality that we could also have thought about that. And so I suppose that, you know, the question of, you know, orientations to learning, whether it's a positive or you know, a negative thing, it touches on a much deeper question of epistemic pluralism or uniformity, and the extent to which, you know, there are single or multiple ways of approaching the, you know, the problem of knowledge and academia as a whole. And I think that's a very important and fruitful question, one we can't deal with completely today, but one that has to be at the back of our minds when we're approaching something that is looking at a specific conception as we are today.
Mary, are you willing to speak to the academic integrity question, at least in the Kenyan context?
Okay. Now, I was just listening to the two of you and also Ishmael about faculty development, let's say in Kenya, and maybe just to inform the listeners. Actually, there's been a lot of faculty development in Kenya. Like I've been working with lecturers since 2009, but at least in the university where I was working, they started in 2007. So this is something that is going on in some, especially the private universities and some public universities. The only problem, I think, is the continuity and sustainability, such that you find that shared understanding that Rebecca talked about it might be lacking because of the turnover in the department. So people come in, others leave, and the ones who are trained are not able maybe to convince the ones who are coming in. So that has been the problem. Otherwise, I think, yeah, we are, I would say, we are not so badly off. We are not so badly off, yeah. And I think faculty orientation to learner-centered or learning-centered, because now that is where we are, is really, really key. And it makes a big difference in the way lecturers go to class and, I mean, the way they teach. The only problem also, I think, is our culture, as Ishmael has said. When it comes to higher education, I can actually go to teach as long as I'm an expert in my discipline. I'm an accountant, I can go and teach that. Yeah, so people believe that as long as you're an expert in that area, then you can actually teach. But if we had maybe a policy at national level requiring lecturers to be trained, it's only primary and secondary school teachers who are required, who are trained. Yeah. So if you, let's say you are never a teacher at primary or secondary, it just means that you've never actually gone through any training. Yeah, but we are doing something. Okay. And then about academic integrity, it's actually, it's not an issue. Okay. I don't know whether I should say it's an issue. It depends on the university, because if, for example, most of the private universities have Turnitin, so they ensure that at least everything that the students, especially like the projects, they have to pass them through Turnitin, the assignments, they have to pass them through Turnitin and so on. Yeah, but it depends. It's not a national thing. So it depends on the university, and most of the private universities, they're really keen to ensure that there is academic integrity. But I think even across the libraries, yeah, they have been trying to work to ensure that there's academic integrity.
I would like to just briefly to comment. There are two organizations that are addressing this problem. These are African-based organizations. One is the Inter-University Council of East Africa. It has really done a great job in terms of, this is the body that brings together all the universities in East and Central Africa, including Rwanda. It's headquartered in Uganda right now, in Uganda, if I'm not wrong, or even Burundi or Rwanda, but it's addressing this issue of academic integrity, student and faculty mobility in the region in order to improve the quality of teaching, and also research. Before, it only handled 3 countries, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. The other organization of which I'm working with is called CODSRIA, Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. Right now, I'm working on their project of training mid-level university leaders in Africa. We had a meeting in Ghana in 2019. There is also, CODSRIA is also handling the teaching aspect of this, and they're gonna be doing the teaching, improving the teaching. So all is not lost, and they are African-based initiatives, and that's actually what is gonna happen. Now, Rebecca and Tristan and Gerardo, here is my challenge to you. As you go through these issues, maybe the next aspect would be to look at the African initiatives towards addressing these issues. I know the challenge you should... Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm so sorry to cut you off, Mike. But I think you missed the very beginning of the presentation. So the whole premise of this study was we were looking at places that local innovations that had happened in African contexts. And I think, well, I'm glad that you brought up those 2 organizations. And there's another really critical one in Kenya that Mary has been a founding member of, which is the Association for Faculty Enrichment in Learning and Teaching, locally led organization. So the whole presentation, or rather the whole study, was set up with the assumption and starting with the objective, I guess, of highlighting the local innovations and attempts to reform pedagogy that are happening across the region in an effort to sort of push back against that deficit narrative that you do see sometimes.
Yeah.
So absolutely, it's a really important.
Thanks.
And also, I noticed the next question in the chat, but I think that also ties into what you just said, which is, I should have said at the beginning of the presentation, we are not looking at this topic because we think it's an issue in these 3 countries or in this region and not an issue anywhere else. It is an issue in the United States of America. It is an issue in the United Kingdom. It is an issue everywhere in the world. Absolutely. That faculty don't have training to teach and think that they're experts and aren't necessarily any good at teaching. So it's absolutely was not the intention of the study, was to focus on an issue in Africa that doesn't exist anywhere else. It was more, the real objective of the study was starting from the important premise that we have a lot of research on what does seem to make a difference in terms of improving student learning, but all of that research has been done in Western contexts. So the study sort of started with that issue, with sort of, we have this body of literature that's all been based on studies that have been done in the West. And can we assume that those same approaches, those same attempts to improve student learning will work in African context, whereas actually you look at most of the reforms that are happening are based on that research. So we were trying to contribute some data, some evidence from the region that would speak to that trend. I'm sorry, Tristan, go ahead.
That's very punctual. And I think I'll just add that this is a fantastic study. I would have liked to be part of it, but I wasn't. I'm just a facilitator today. So I really want to make sure not to take credit for any of the excellent work that has been presented today. So one of our questions, right, to continue drawing on some of these connections, right? And I think that's one of the great advantages of looking at this from a comparative perspective. But one of our students, Yoli Liu, is really pointing out very appropriately that many of these questions are also similar, in areas that, as I know her work, regions that are of interest to her, right? Many of these questions are of particular interest in the Asian context. So I guess I'll take that question to say, what particularities did you find in these three countries that you studied that maybe could give us some pointers about what to look for, right? What aspects of sort of the social structures and the cultural elements that influence teaching could we paying attention, not only in the African context, but rather what can we learn from these to apply to our efforts to improve teaching and learning in other countries, in continents as well?
Rebecca, you want me to mention something? Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. So, for example, in Kenya, if I think about faculty development, it basically started, it was connected to British, being, we were British colony. But then, like in my university, we had connections with people in Britain, and that is how it actually started. Yeah. And then in 2009, I was able to host a postgraduate certificate in academic practice, and basically that is how it started in our university, and moved on to the other universities. Yeah. So basically there is an origin somewhere where you start. And maybe Rebecca can add about Ghana and Botswana.
I actually wanted to give Tristan a chance to come in because he raised his hand earlier. Do you want to take that, Tristan, or?
I was actually going to say something about the previous question about academic integrity. So you go and then I'll come in afterwards because it will change topic otherwise.
Well, I think really the point is more the point I was making before in terms of no, there's not something special in terms of the African context that we studied that would be different from other parts of the world, I don't think. And that you can see, structures around whether you need to listen to, so some similarities I think that you could find in studies on teaching and learning in East Asia is, as opposed to studies in the sub-Saharan African context, you can often see literature speaking to sort of power differences. So, the need to be deferential to the elder or to the expert in the classroom, and that getting into on both sides of that equation, both the expert wanting to that sort of status and also students feeling that they should defer. That can be definitely a sort of, I guess, a similar cultural context that can get in the way of some of the reforms that we're talking about. And certainly there's political dimensions as well. I know, Tristan mentioned the definition of critical thinking that we chose to select. We chose it mostly because this is the definition that institutions generally are talking about when they're talking about implementing reform, both based on critical thinking. It's sort of a technical definition. It's sort of what you might expect to find in employment. But there's no doubt that there's another definition of critical thinking that you could look at that has a very strong political dimension. I started as I mentioned, the first study I did at my doctoral level was in Rwanda, and absolutely there's not going to be a whole lot of reform for criticality in terms of political challenge to a standing government in the Rwandan context currently. And you can see the same in other parts of the world. And that definitely would play a role in terms of supporting critical thinking with that sort of a nature to it. But we were looking at a much more sort of, can you look at analysis? Can you analyze evidence? Can you figure out if there's different kinds of evidence that you should be using or not using? Much more of a sort of a technical definition. But I think maybe the bigger point in terms of the webinar in general is that what we are looking at here are themes that you can see everywhere in the world. It's not that there's certain political or cultural contexts that are more likely to lead to pedagogical reform than others. You see similar barriers and similar opportunities everywhere. But I guess what we were really interested in looking at in the African space was, first of all, to add to the data that we have, as I mentioned before, but also to specifically think about what this looks like in less resourced parts of the world, institutions with very little financial capital to draw on when trying to make these changes that they want to make.
So of course we start running against time. So I'd like to invite Tristan's comment about academic integrity, and maybe we can approach one, hopefully two questions, because it's very, very active indeed.
Yeah, I'll be quick then. Yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, I think, you know, academic integrity is an issue in the countries that we're working with, but only insofar as it's a global issue. I mean, I think, you know, the question of integrity and corruption is part of the current system of higher education that we have, and it's not only in terms of you know, marks awarded, but also in terms of who gets to go to what university. And something tells me that not too far from where you are now in Boston, you may have faced a few of those issues in recent years. And it strikes me that this is simply a manifestation of higher education as exchange value rather than use value. You know, in contemporary times, a degree is a mechanism for allocating scarce forms of highly remunerated employment. And as long as it has that function, there will be corruption in higher education in every context of many different forms. You know, this is higher education as you know, a way of allocating resources and competition for them. So as long as it's that, we're going to be facing that. And so I think we need to look at integrity with that broader perspective, rather than seeing it as a kind of something that turns up in a few places where there's not very much regulation or something like that. I think it's linked to these broader questions of what kind of university and higher education system globally that we have.
Excellent. So I think one question, and of course, hopefully we will continue engaging with this topic. This is perhaps one of the most active Q&As that I've seen, at least in the webinars I facilitated for the center in this year. I think the question of technology is one that seems timely, perhaps not more important than any other aspect that has been discussed, but perhaps more pressing and more timely, just given the pandemic context that we are facing. And I'm just wondering, as just kind of taking this idea from Samuel in the chat, right? So just in the interest of time, maybe I'll just present it very briefly. Are there any thoughts that you may like to share in relation to technology? What can we consider? What can we, how can we think about technology in a different way, right? Because we often think about it as just a resource that you either have or don't have, rather than a set of instruments that we can adapt, that we can modify, that we can be very creative with, and so on. So any thoughts about technology would be very welcome from any of our panelists.
Mary, do you want to speak to the sphere experience that Samuel's mentioning? Because there's been a lot of technology use there, or more broadly.
Maybe broadly. It's just that I think with COVID-19, everyone has had to use technology. Yeah, so before, a number of universities had the Moodle platform, Blackboard, but they were just using that for uploading notes. But I think after this, I mean, with the COVID-19, the blended learning and using technology, I mean, for learning purposes will be improved. Yeah, it will be much better than what it has been. So we've had a project working across the East African countries in a number of universities, and we've been able to facilitate sessions online. Yeah, so and lecturers have been able to take up the course online. So I think we are heading somewhere, yeah, and something is happening. And maybe this is also just in line with somebody who was asking about the universities that have taken up faculty development. Actually, the Sphere project, there is now faculty development across the East African region. So we have had to work with 2 universities in Uganda, 2 universities in Tanzania, and of course we have the Kenyan universities who had implemented that. Yeah.
So we are running out of time. So I do want to take the opportunity to thank Mary, Tristan, and Rebecca for sharing your research with all of us today. I also want to remind you all of our January webinar on January 19th. And in the meantime, well, the topic for that webinar is going to be our ranking still fit for purpose, and will include our colleagues Ellen Hazelcorn and Alex Usher. But in the meantime, we wish you a safe holiday season, and we look forward to seeing you in the new year. Once again, thank you very much to Mary, Tristan, and Rebecca for joining us and for presenting a webinar that has had a lot of discussion activity. And thank you for doing this in such a flexible and engaging way.
Thank you so much, everybody.